You must be in big demand with your expertise on supply chains. You know, we saw the lumber prices going up again in the U.S. Shortage of supply. That's going to affect many people in the world, certainly in North America. The chip shortages, maybe lead times are slowing, but it's still quite dire. Do you think it's really steadying? Do you think we've seen the peak, or do you think there's just been a lull and it's going to continue, maybe even continue to get worse?
That is a great question. The way to think about it is that the chip shortage, there are really no quick fixes. And also, this is unlikely to be the last major technology supply chain disruption that we will see that affects so many industries. The way we look at it is that, most of the semiconductor manufacturing facilities around the world have been running hot since Q3 last year. And we believe that it will be sometime towards late 2022 when we start to see signs of the easing of some of the constraints. And if we look at the earnings of the last 2 weeks or so, we will realize that really the impact is spreading. Auto was the first, but it was not alone. And now you see it's hitting PC, your smartphone, 5G networking, consumer electronics, you name it. Quite frankly, all of us should probably be a little bit concerned about where to get our holiday gadgets this year. But what that means is that, depending on which categories of electronics we're talking about, we could probably see some of the industries continue to face some level of supply shortage throughout 2023 or maybe even into 2024. So I would say we're in the worst of it. It's not yet over.
What needs to be done for the supply to pick up with the demand? Is it largely a private sector issue? Is there something government can do?
That's a great question. First of all, to understand, what's the reason why it's so hard to add supply, just to put it into perspectives, building a leading edge semiconductor factory, that's typically 2 to 3 years. Even if we're just adding capacity to existing factory, that's easily more than a year. So that's why there are really no quick fixes. And in terms of what people can be doing, both in the private sector and government-wise, it comes down to a few things. Short term, really, there's not much. People are building war rooms and scouring their supply chains to reprioritize where chips go into and trying to redirect, demand from their customers to products where they actually have supplies. But what's encouraging is some of the long-term measures that we start to see being put in place by both the government as well as the private sector. That typically starts with,
you talk about the. Sorry, I was just going to ask you about, the amount of scaling up and investment required for a company, let alone an entire country, to get that leading edge. What's the time frame then for competition out of China?
That's a great question. So the competition out of China is definitely an interesting topic. And I would say that there are massive uncertainties around that, right? It comes down to a few things. Number one is, on the U.S. side, obviously, some of the semiconductor equipment and some of the semiconductor materials and manufacturing technologies still very much reside in the certain countries outside of China. China heavily relies on that. And there is certainly indigenous innovation happening in China right now. We see a lot of that in the semiconductor design space. But at the same time, a lot of the intellectual properties, the manufacturing, the equipment, the materials still rely on sourcing internationally. So we would say it's going in the direction to be a little bit more self-reliant on the China side, but it's a small step so far.
Across supply chain issues more broadly, it's not just chips that we're talking about, right? But is there this idea that we need an overhaul? How do you make components that are so specific to be more interchangeable, to be more flexible, to be more scalable in that sense?
That's a great question. And that's what some of the companies are doing right now. If you look within a certain sector, even just within the auto, right, certain companies are faring a little bit better than others amid this shortage. And that's because their designs are a little bit more modular to some extent. It uses more standardized components and less customized components, which make it easier to swap in and out. Another thing that companies are doing is that to let the supply chain team play a much bigger role in informing the product design, reducing the number of parts going into a product or informing the modularity going into a product so that you can de-risk the supply chain a little bit more. And ultimately, externally to a company, we also need just industry-wide a little bit more of the collaboration up and down the supply chain. How do you reserve the capacity so that when you need it, you can have it, right? Like we see the U.S. government pushing for that at this time, but also the private sectors are investing along this line as well.
Well, one of the longer term effects of this extreme supply chain constraint and the chip shortage result in more of a dissemination of production around the world. We already see, some chip companies trying to boost their profile even higher. Still seems very concentrated in a few places. Do you see that changing?
We definitely see that changing, but it will be a very long journey, because if you look at the entire semiconductor and hardware value chain, it is highly complex, going from equipment all the way to device assembly, right? When we look at the value chain detail steps in our annual technology report, we do see the concentration of each value chain step. You just have an entrenched set of players and economies playing a big role there. So as a result, to fundamentally separate the supply chains, it's extraordinarily costly. In fact, it's probably extremely unlikely for any country or any geography to claim to be fully independent in their supply chain in any near to medium term.
We've seen another incremental development when it comes to the U.S. China tech rivalry and tech distrust, right, with the vote to remove licenses from China Telecom from operating in the U.S. How much does this worsen the supply issue when it comes to technology and security sensitive sectors like chips?
That's a good question. I think this is a general theme around what some people call the technology decoupling, which was started by U.S. China, but now it's no longer just a U.S. China issue. We see all of the EU, Japan, Korea all pledging unprecedented amount of money into building, self-reliant technology and supply chain domestically. I would say that any further export control any country put on the table just really further accelerates the path of that. But we've been seeing that happening for a while. It won't be the last time this happens. And there are massive uncertainties that remain. It's very hard to precisely call which next company will be put on the list. And there's also, on the other hand, on the China side, there are also uncertainties around, the notion of common prosperity, the clampdown of some of the national champions, all raises questions around, how fast indigenous innovation is going to happen and how much of the U.S. control will be put in place to further limit that.